Hey guys, welcome to the Pace Studio here in New York City. We are here with a very special guest today, Mr. Thurston Moore.
Hey,
Thurston, thanks for coming around, man. We really appreciate it.
Right on.
So you have a new album out. It's called Rock and Roll Consciousness.
Yes.
And I was reading about the album, and I know you recorded it with the band that you've now been playing with for some years.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's the second album you've made. Is that right? With this band in the studio?
Yeah, this is more totally a group record with this group.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Like, was this the music that you would have produced anyway with, whatever team of musicians you might have had in the studio? This is a product of these four musicians specifically.
Well, I suppose as far as songwriting goes, it's hard to say, but I think maybe I would have written these songs regardless of who I was playing with. But they did. I was thinking about who they were when I was writing the song, so it's maybe a little hard to answer. But I knew that the guitar player in my group, James Sedowitz, I wanted him to sort of express himself in a way that I know he can, which is amazingly. And so I was thinking about that in some of the songs. Like, this section would be really cool with like James's lead guitar on it. So. The first record we did a few years ago called The Best Day, that was not in my mind at all. In fact, I didn't really realize what the group would be until we actually started day one of that first session.
So is this something where, almost like, I think your process was a little bit in Sonic Youth, where you would sort of bring a song structure maybe to the group and then have those players fill it out with their sort of idiosyncrasies? Is that essentially the same process now?
Yeah, it's the same but different. I mean, with Sonic Youth, it's a different experience because we all came up together since we were in our early 20s, and we were together for 25 plus years. And that relationship was really based on having this really democratic forum, where we would all work together. And regardless of who brought what into a session, it became a group composition, and it was credited as such, and it always would be. So, it was. I would never be so presumptuous to say I'm writing the lyricism of Steve Shelley's drum playing, and he's certainly not saying well, I helped on those lyrics that you're singing. So these conversations never really arose so much. I think maybe I might have had some feelings about that at some point in the '90s. It's like, wait a minute, I feel like maybe I should get maybe a little more share because of all these lyrics or all these structures, whatever. But the idea is that group was a forum for all of us to bring something into. No matter what you brought into, no matter how alpha I was bringing stuff in, or whatever, it didn't really matter. It was all about it existing in that context. This group is me kind of doing the same thing, but I'm not allowing the material to become so democratically discussed and say oh, let's try this, or let's play it backwards, or let's it's like, oh, I'm going to play this part, and me going wow, that part really just radicalizes and changes everything about what I brought in. So I guess I have to deal with that, and it was always really cool to deal with that because it became something else, and it became this other thing, and I would allow it to happen. Whereas in this group, it's like I'm basically putting my name on the marquee, and I'll bring the song in, and it's just like I'm not writing what Steve Shelley plays or what Deb Googe plays or what James Sedowitz plays, but I have chosen them to be in my solo group for their expertise, and it's like I know they're going to play something really amazing, and they're going to come up with their own musicality, and that's why I want to work with them. But I'm going to take all the songwriting credit.
Right.
And so that relationship is a bit of a conflict there. And I always remember this interview I read with David Bowie, where he was just saying I'm going to it's my record, And you see interviews with some of the musicians on his records, I wrote that riff, that's my song, and it's like, it may very well be, but it was in the employ of this vision. And so I'm not so hard-lined as that. It's just I kind of, I feel like I want to be in more of a four-piece gang in a way. I like the idea of a group. I wish I could have a group name besides Thurston Moore Group.
It's Thurston Moore is the name on the record. You could just put group at the end and just.
I actually was going to. I mean, I did a record called Chelsea Light Moving that originally was Thurston Moore, and the record was called Chelsea Light Moving. And at that time, I was like, maybe I'll just use that as a band name. It's a really good band name, as opposed to just a record title.
And you could call the album Thurston Moore.
Well, yeah, there's always that too. I mean, Sonic Youth went through that too. At some point, I wanted to sort of really change the game. And when we were recording a record called Washing Machine, there was this idea that we bandied about, like, let's call the group Washing Machine. Like, let's just like stop Sonic Youth and call it Washing Machine, you know? And that'll be our next record. And at that time, we actually kind of seriously considered this, I think. And we were going out on tour, this impending tour, supporting REM, like in some places in the USA. And we said, well, can you list us as Washing Machine?
Yeah.
And it was just like, no. If you want to play the gigs, you play them as Sonic Youth. You can't play them as Washing Machine. I was like, but we're the same people. We're playing the same music. And so it was always this idea of wanting to sort of challenge that, you know, that expectation, you know, or the idea of being a brand and not a band, which is sort of like a thing that I understand, but I kind of want to sort of always want to kind of play with a little bit.
Do you find now that, you know, this many years later, even as you make your solo albums, that there is a certain expectation you're fighting against? People have maybe an expectation of what a Thurston Moore record sounds like. Is it something you like to push back against, or maybe play, you know, right through?
Well, I realize that I have a certain language that I use, and I'm not trying to create some kind of wholly other new thing just to reinvent or whatever. I like having this ongoing, identifiable sound or whatever I have, you know, or whatever anybody has. You know, it's like I go to certain records by all different artists, knowing that I appreciate what they do. I want to hear what they do all the time, and sometimes that they can change it up, and it can be really surprising and wonderful. And sometimes it's really frustrating because I like so much what they do. It's like, no, don't go in that. Don't wear that cloak of some other genre or something like that.
Yeah, that seems always a balance that a lot of bands need to strike. Is, you know, they don't want to get hit for sounding the same, but they also don't want to get hit for moving too far out of their zone.
I guess. I mean, to me, I feel like I'm always sort of defined by whatever contemporary experience I'm living in. So it's like that's always going to be there. I mean, the record I write now is hardly the record I would have written 10 years ago. You know, and it's not going to be the record I write in 10 years. So it's like I trust the actuality of the moment, you know, to be the flavor of the record. So, but I know that. You know, there could be the critique that it's like, oh, it's wheels spinning. And it's like, well, I don't know. I like that familiarity. I mean, I like genres that have a community sound. Like, oh, reggae, it all sounds the same. It's like, well, I like that. I like that there's this shared idea of like what these musical aspects are, you know, in reggae or in hardcore or in black metal or whatever. It's like, I like knowing that these genres have these shared communities of sound. Everybody sort of agrees on certain tropes or whatever like that. Maybe Sonic Youth didn't really have that so much because we were sort of taking from so many different places, and all these traditional places, and then all these really unorthodox places as well, and trying to sort of create these different collaborations, you know, with the experimental and the traditional. Yeah. And I still do that. I mean, I feel still like I'm doing that. It's just like, wow, this feels like Buffalo Springfield and Merzbow. You know, so that's just the way it is.
Yeah. Well, you know, it sort of leads me to something I wanted to ask you about, you know, in terms of making the record that you are, you know, the environment that you're in at that moment. You're based in London now.
Yeah.
And of course you're so associated with New York, going back years. And, you know, I was thinking Sonic Youth came up at a time when New York was really in kind of one of its magic periods of creativity and art and expression. And, you know, as we talk about all the time around here, you know, New York changes by the day, and to a lot of people's minds, not necessarily for the better. And I wonder now, like, you know, you have a certain remove. you know, have you, in a sense, like given up on this city being what it was to you, you know, in the 80s, or what it could be for young people now?
Well, I think everybody has their time in any city they live in. If they're going to a metropolis to sort of be artists, no matter what your discipline is, you know, music or film or painting, and I think that experience that you have at that time in your life, usually, you know, in your post high school, early 20s, and that's sort of really, that's your city at that time. And so I would never sort of disparage the city for its contemporary makeup that it has. It is quite different than what I experienced in the 70s into the 80s, and you know, it certainly becomes a more moneyed city. It becomes a city that's more, that in a way is safer, due to real estate demanding a more sort of moneyed social culture. And you know, there's pros and cons to what that is. It was a lot of street life, a lot of street crime, a lot of desperation in the inner city in the 70s. Do I miss that? I don't know. I mean, I have certainly romantic kind of retrospect on it, you know, because it's, you know, holy poverty. It's, you know, it's Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac in the streets with no money and writing poetry and just sort of being bards to the beatific vision of, you know, of the visions of the urban poet. Yeah, I mean, that was a great time to be. And I still think, in a way, that aesthetic still exists for a lot of young artists, but they don't really necessitate the city anymore, because we're so interconnected, and that the utopia of the internet keeps us in a place where we don't have to sort of leave the confines of wherever we live and still share. And I like that. And you know, the city is a different place now, and it's become high-end real estate, and the cities have been somewhat saved by that. So it's just a different characteristic. So do I miss it? Well, yeah, I kind of miss it. I can sort of write songs and poems about, like, you know, the misty streets of my youth. But,
right. I think there's one on the new album.
Yes, there is actually.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Right. So, you know, I know there's still sort of a mythology to the city that is sort of inescapable. And,
well, there's always it's a sacred earth. I mean, it's like the city will always have its histories, its ghosts. It's you know, it's like it's and that's always going to be here, no matter how many you know, bogus golden towers exist in Midtown. This is like that stuff is you know, that's BS. You know.
Yeah. In sort of in that same vein, in terms of the power that the internet has had to sort of democratize or to really sort of spread the gospel into places where it may not have been. You know, I know that one thing that comes up a lot is that there's so many different sort of channels now, so many different kind of specific sounds going to specific people, that it's very easy to kind of like what you like and not venture too far outside it very often. You know, you're just constantly fed what you like. And I wonder if that has some larger effect on like rock and roll, you know, stripping it of its ability to kind of be this revolutionary force, if it's just sort of compartmentalized so cleanly to various audiences, you know.
Well, I mean, it certainly is more factionalized by dint of, you know, you are in this bubble on the internet.
Yeah.
You know, for things like music, art, entertainment, as well as other dialogues, political dialogue. You know, it's just like, and there's a lot of sort of kind of weird, nefarious work that goes on, where there's these bots that sort of come in and battle you, you know, because of your ideologies, and it's like I find it both a little harrowing, but at the same time, I think it's also something that's easy to sort of see how insidious it is, and how it can be balanced and possibly rectified by continuing to work in the the physical world. When bands ask me, like, you know, oh, what did you guys do? What should we do? You know, we have all these songs, and I was like, well, just keep putting them up out there in the digital realm and on your social media and on the SoundClouds of the world, but make something. You know, make something that is vibratory, that you can touch, and that you've created in the physical world, and don't do it for money. You have to use money to do it, but you don't have to use that much money. There's lots of economic means of making things, be it a cassette or a stapled book or whatever you do. CDR, you know, it's just like these things are all just sort of they're really elemental, and you can gift them, and by gifting them, it's like you're passing something on. It's through touch, it's through all this, it's all the sensories of the human animal, and that is a really good place to start. Like, do that. And I don't really ever see digital media overtaking it. I can see it being a dominant force of communication, as it already is. And but I always think the library of you know, extensions of the physical self existing. Yeah. The book, the magazine, the record, the CD, whatever it is, the thing you can touch and you can smell, you can
Right. You're
taste,
still a buyer of music?
Am I a buyer of music?
Buyer of physical, you buy records and play them on your turntable, like an analog.
That's all
experience.
I do. I mean, to me, I find my meditation in going into primarily secondhand stores. I'm all about vintage. I'm not in new. New is, if it's going to be new, keep it. Just keep it in the digital media. No, I'm all about like being in that zone where you have that history, and that history of the artifacts and the archives, just kind of like palpitating.
We're sitting in one,
and we're sitting here with all these live recordings.
Yeah, this is the real. This is actual tape with the real music right on it. Yeah. You know, you could burn this in a fire and it would be gone.
It would be gone, but it's sort of like, it's like, you know, you're burning something that's really emblematic. But let it, even if you burn it, it becomes smoke. It becomes part of the atmosphere. It's like, to me, you know, I find it like all these documents are really sort of spiritual documents, you know, and I think I find solace in it, and I find intrigue in it. I find inspiration in it, and I'll spend inordinate amounts of time in these places, and I with either being by myself or with like-minded, you know, compatriots, of just being there, you know. And you don't have to be a consumer. You don't have to purchase anything, you know. So, but of course, if you're like, you know, if you're like a mad collector, it's like, yeah, go for it, you know, like, you know, trade some stuff in and get one really good thing, and like, you know, and it's just, you know, those are your friends, you know. Those are your, you know, and you kind of, they're your cards, and you give them around. They're tickets, you know, to each other, and so I like that activity. And maybe it's fairly and like an old-fashioned thing, but I like old-fashioned too. I like old. Yeah. I was going to call the record "We Are the New Old." Yeah.
Was it voted down?
No, there's no vote in this.
Yeah, that's right. In keeping with our times, right? Yeah. This is a dictatorial.
No, that's a working title.
Yeah, right.
I went for Rock and Roll Consciousness because it was, I don't know why. I just I kind of just, it felt right to me. Well,
I was gonna ask you about the title of the record. Actually, you have been for several years now. You've been teaching a poetry workshop. I think in the summers at Naropa University.
It's a summer writing workshop at Naropa University in Boulder, Colorado. And that university was founded by a Tibetan scholar, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who's no longer alive, at least not on this planet. And he
not in analog, only in digital.
Yeah, exactly. And he was the teacher for Allen Ginsberg as far as Buddhist practice is concerned. And Allen Ginsberg and Anne Waldman founded the Summer Writing Workshop in 1974. And it was called, and it is called, the Jack Kerouac School of Disembodied Poetics. And I became aware of it when my fascination with the history of underground poetry production came into play as I got older into my 40s, and I was just like always being interested in literature and always being interested in marginalized literature and beat literature and its relationship to what I liked in music, like the relationship between literature and music, from Bob Dylan to Patti Smith to most of punk rock and more sort of art rock and intellectual rock, and that's what I liked. And then certainly in R&B music and hip hop, it was just like the literary was key as an element, and that was something that really led me into investigating like post-war poetry, that was kind of lost, from the shelves. And so you'd have to go and find these stapled Mimeo journals from the 60s. And I started really creating a library of these things. And Anne Waldman came up and did a poetry reading in Northampton, Massachusetts, where I was living through most of the early 2000s, and saw this library and asked me to teach at the school, and realizing what my interest was, and primarily self-taught. I wasn't coming out of the academy with, going to courses focusing on poetics or whatever, but I was gleaning it, certainly. So I eventually, I started teaching there. I taught there for the last 5 years. Mm-hmm. The faculty there historically has been always incredible. It's like William Burroughs and Kathy Acker and Diane DePrima and Cecil Taylor and Gergi Corso and Joanne Kiger and Eileen Miles has been teaching there a lot, and I've taught a lot with her through these last years, same time. And I think being there, I came into contact with a lot of Buddhist philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't really wanting to sort of, have it become something that became my thing. I don't know. I wasn't really looking for authority as far as like a teacher in the realm of like religious thought, but I liked a lot of what I was reading, and the word consciousness is always bandied about in there.
Yeah, well, that was what I was thinking about. Whether it seemed like it was probably not totally coincidental. Having a rock and roll consciousness as you're kind of immersed in something that would be very consciousness oriented. Yeah,
consciousness. The whole idea of mindfulness and through meditation, you see the relationship between the physical and the metaphysical, and this sense of universality, and which all these great concepts of kindness and sharing, and it's really it's really in complete and benign opposition to like what we see in the political agendas that we're being ensnared by, about greed and the devaluation of women and those who are at a loss from poverty and war. And so I like these concepts, and I thought they were in the idea of consciousness. I was like, well, where do I find that? Through what meditation? I don't really feel like I want to sort of get into the practice of meditation so much, but I do know that I do get something from it in some other sense. And I said, I guess I find what people find in meditation, I find in blaring feedback from an amplifier. Yeah. It's like, well, what is that? Where is that meditation coming from? Why, because it's devotional. I really love it. It's really spiritual. I see rock and roll as being historically coming from, the voice of the people of the earth. It comes from gospel. It comes from church. It comes from this kind of spiritual mindedness. And then it becomes really interesting when it's sort of treated academically. It's just like you have people like John Cage coming out of academy and going like, how can we liberate this idea of music being so, stuck in the academy? Let's take that out of there and focus on these other things that can open it up, which he did so magnificently. And rock and roll does it too. It's just like it's this chain breaking kind of idea of music. That's where I was like, it's rock and roll consciousness. Rock and roll being anything and everything. It's not just Chuck Berry. God bless Chuck Berry, but it's like, it's everything. It is gospel, it is hip hop, it is R&B, it is everything. It's jazz. It's like it's rock and roll. It's just like this, the idea of what that is. So that was the grandiosity of that title, but I didn't want to make I didn't want to make a big deal of it. I was just like, this has got rock and roll consciousness.
Right, and that is the new record, which is out in April, I believe. Is that right?
It came out a couple of weeks ago, and we came over and we did a gig in Vancouver, and then we came down the West Coast in Seattle, Portland, and LA, and San Francisco, and Santa Ana, and then we played in Austin and Dallas, and then we just did a show here in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm.
And you'll be back in New York, I think, end of July at the Bowery Ballroom. Is that right?
Yeah, we're gonna be playing all year. We're entertaining all invitations.
Well, anytime you want to come back and play for us, the invitation is certainly open.
I would love to do that.
We'll find a tape here that I think you played on at some point, and we'll, for comparison's sake.
It's very possible.
Yeah, I'm sure there's one here somewhere. We'll have to find it when we're done. But for now, we'll let you go. But Thurston Moore, thank you so much for stopping by the Pace Studio and talking with us. It was a great pleasure.
Fantastic.
Thanks a lot, guys. We'll see you later at the Pace Studio.